You can start recording anytime. All right. Greetings, folks. For those that have never met me before, I'm Andrew Grimberg. I'm the manager of the release engineering team here at the Linux Foundation. And my little talk here is kind of a PSA, a public service announcement, about changes that are coming related to Wiki and issue tracking, mostly being driven by Atlassian, the company that we're using for the vast majority of projects, since we are using Confluence and Jira on a lot of LFN projects. So let's just go ahead and get into that. I may be overstating this a little bit, but the Atlassian made an announcement last year stating that they are going to be ending support of Confluence Server and Jira Server in 2024. And this causes us problems because they give us open source licenses on those platforms, which is what allows your projects to actually use them without paying a dime outside of maintenance of the systems. So here's what we do know. On February 15 of this year, which was in 2 days, licensing for plugins to Confluence and Jira will no longer be available for new plugins. So any plugins that we currently have, they'll continue working, and when our licenses need to be renewed, we'll be able to renew them, but we won't be able to acquire new plugins. So if there's any plugins that people are asking for, in 2 days, we'll basically not be able to get new ones. Now, admittedly, all of our Confluence and Jira systems at this point are fairly well stable on their plugin sets, so that's not going to be too much of an issue, I don't think. February 15 of next year, Confluence and Jira server editions will be end of lifed. And we will no longer be able to renew our licenses for any component of those systems. Now, what happens with Atlassian is when the license expires, the system goes into a read-only mode. There is no way to add or change content in those systems at that point. All we can do is log in, read stuff, or update the license, but we won't be able to get new licenses. Ergo, we're at a standstill. Now, Atlassian does offer a system called Data Center, and they also offer what's called Atlassian Cloud. They had been giving us data center licenses when we ask for them, but they keep telling us that they're not going to be doing that, especially going forward. So we are not 100% certain that come the cutoff of next year that we'll be able to get those licenses anymore. Additionally, the migration to cloud has a whole bunch of other drawbacks. So what we are actually suggesting is that we go through the process of migrating both wikis and issue tracking to either GitHub or GitLab, depending upon wherever the project needs to go. As we could, however, potentially basically transition the systems to Data Center. There is a whole long process behind that because we basically have to rebuild the systems. It is a different application that we have to install, and we have to relicense all plugins, and we have to import the data and everything else like that. It is possible. We will still run into problems though on the wikis because ONAP especially has been running into this a lot. They've had a spam issue. There are no good plugins to combat that outside of locking down the wiki to the point where you can only make changes if you are authorized to, and then you got to come up with a process for how do people get authorized. It does also continue to bring in the costs of running those systems. Those costs may actually go up a bit because the system requirements for data center require a beefier system, especially if we go to a clustered setup, because data center does do clustering. Again, we have no firm commitment from Atlassian that we'll be able to continue getting data center licenses in perpetuity the way we've been getting the Jira server and Confluence server licenses. So this is a problem for us. The Git platforms. So GitHub is already the de facto mirror of record for all of our Gerrit projects. We've got a few projects that are actually operating completely out of GitHub already. Those ones generally don't have a Jira or Confluence, or they might be piggybacking on another one. like the LFN Confluence specifically. So it makes sense to migrate issue tracking to GitHub for most projects. For those projects that for some reason have a reason to go to GitLab, say for instance, ONAP with their hierarchical repository configuration, they don't make a good fit in GitHub, they do in a GitLab. We would recommend actually transitioning the issue tracking and the wikis to the Git platforms that would be a potential target for migration of repositories in the future. Wiki on either platform is going to actually help alleviate the spam issues that projects have been having, just because of the fact that Wiki changes have to go through code review. It is possible on either platform to put in workflows that allow for known contributors to just get their changes automatically published into the wiki, just the same way they do right now with Confluence, where you just make your edits and it's there. But for new contributors, they would be forced to go into code review, which would, essentially what that does is it moves the spam problem to moderation problem, because people do have to then do code review of those changes, but it's a lot better than having the actual wiki end up with spam on it. But we do lose access to any plugins that we currently have in use with Jira or Confluence with either of these setups. So there's definitely give and take here. On the topic of data center, it would operate similar to how we currently do it, where you basically have the siloed systems. As I said, the cost may go up slightly with this. As a cost savings measure, we might actually look at doing a consolidation of Jira and Confluence systems if they were to go to data center into a cluster. Upside of that is that we'd have rolling updates on those, so we'd actually have less downtime. The downside is that we would have to consolidate all of the plugins that the various communities are using and come up with logistic ways of dealing with any name collisions and namespaces, particularly in Jira. And we're not certain how we would go about that. The spam issue would continue to be a problem because, as I said earlier, we have no good way of doing that outside of locking down the wiki very tightly. Migration to Atlassian Cloud comes pretty much with all the same caveats for the data center edition, but we also lose the single sign-on that you currently have with your LFID. LFX Insights, last I knew, does not work against Atlassian Cloud, Jira or Confluence setups. And the license that Atlassian is providing to open source projects comes with a limited number of accounts that can be attached to it. Now, across LFN, I think we actually exceed the license count, seat count that they are giving to folks. But as an individual project, I think we're below that. So there's some maneuverability in there. But again, as I said, all the problems we currently have with our current setups exist in all of that. And that's actually the last slide I have. I'm only taking up about 7 minutes here. And this is where I'm pretty certain people have questions, comments, and concerns. But the whole point of this particular presentation was to bring this to the community's attention, that we have some amount of time, just about a year, to make a decision and a move, because we have to move no matter what to something.
Okay, I'll bite. So, and we can work the slides backwards, but so what is really the reason why we would be losing SSO? Because at least in my
Atlassian does not provide SSO for anything except to the Atlassian crowd identity system. We've been asking them for like 5 years to provide the ability to do that.
So the reason I'm asking is that I work for an organization which has Jira Cloud, and we run our own identity provider, and it is completely integrated with Jira Cloud.
The reason why that works is because you have all the same email addresses, I'm assuming, correct? They all come from the same domain?
No.
No? Are you sure?
No. Yes.
Okay, so the last time we talked to Atlassian about this specifically, they stated that our configuration for SSO is impossible without Atlassian Cloud, and they had no plans on making it possible. And that's mostly because of the fact that we have so many varying email address backends, and we allow people to essentially authenticate via Google, via pretty much any social media out there, along with standard email addresses. And they're like, no, we won't accept your SSO provider.
Okay, fair enough.
So
I
that's the
mean,
reason why we say that. Now that might have changed, and they might not have told us, because admittedly Atlassian doesn't like to talk to us for some reason. um, maybe because we have so many licenses with them, I don't know.
yeah. Okay.
Next, anyone?
Andy, this is
Yes.
Dave. Um, I think I mentioned to you before that I use the Jira API to, generate release management tasks for ONAP. Do you know what the API situation is for GitHub and GitLab for their issue tracking?
Well, so GitHub and GitLab, you definitely have API access. Both platforms have very well documented APIs.
Specifically for issue tracking.
Literally every single component of their
Okay.
system has an API call to it.
Okay, that's
On the
great.
GitHub side, if you're using Python, there is a GH API package that is literally up to date with every change in the GitHub API. It is programmatically updated. On the GitLab side, GitLab itself maintains a Python project for connecting to their API. So in both cases, if there's something you can do in GitHub as a user, then you have an API to be able to do it yourself that way.
Okay, good to know. The other thing I was going to mention with regard to spam is that I think, as you know, I modified the setup on the ONAP wiki. I had noticed that all the spam that we were getting was associated with a new space. And so, I thought, well, what if we prohibit users from creating a new space? You could still create new pages on the existing spaces, but you can't create a new space. Anyway, since I changed that, as far as I can tell, we haven't gotten any more spam. Now that's just one data point, but I thought it was
I
kind of
do know we
interesting.
have actually seen some spam come into the ONAP wiki even after that change.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
I missed it. I guess I haven't
Yeah,
noticed it.
there was actually an issue where we lost the landing page.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah, I remember that, but that wasn't. I didn't. In talking to Jessica about that, I didn't get the impression that that was necessarily,
I think it was actually
something
spam. I
external.
think it may have been spam related, honestly.
Okay.
So we've tried to tighten down the permissions as much as possible, but still make the wikis as usable as possible for the communities. But that unfortunately leaves us vulnerable to certain problems.
Yeah. Well, I was just looking out, I mean, we were getting spam, pretty routinely every few days. And I just looked at the last, I don't know, 10 days, and I don't see any new spam
Okay,
on
well,
the
that's good to
ONAP
hear.
wiki. So, but granted, it is just one data point. So,
Right. Anybody else have comments or questions?
Okay, so can we go back one slide?
Sure.
I think, oh, it's not actually more than one. So
This one?
essentially, if we, so it's about the workflow for wiki updates on GitHub or GitLab
Yes.
for projects which actually are in Gerrit. How would that work?
So my recommendation on that would actually be that we put the wikis not in Gerrit, but actually on the platform themselves. There's no reason to run the wikis out of Gerrit. So it would just
So,
be basic workflow in Git, in the Git platform. Now, I will say this, um, Robert, you specifically are aware of the fact that I was doing a little bit of a skunkworks project on being able to trigger workflows, validation and merge workflows from Garrett changes. We have finally started to actually work on doing that after the proof of concept that I had put together last fall. So we're starting to make progress on that, just starting. So what does that mean? It does mean that if everything falls into the place the way I expect it to, given my validation testing and the work we've already done, we will be able to do pretty much the entire validation workflow from a Garrett repository that is being mirrored into GitHub or GitLab and triggering the respective GitHub action or GitLab pipeline.
Right. So that does that include also it would include the possibility of raising actually a PR against the repository and then having the review in Garrett, or would this
So
be
right now
basically
we're looking at
yeah.
the Garrett to platform side of things.
Oh,
The
okay.
platform to Garrett is a separate problem, but it is related in the fact that, basically what we have to do is we have to come up with a way through um, actions, pipelines, or some additional application that gets installed into the various platforms to monitor those repositories and then do the squashing and playing around with PRs and MRs to make them conform to Garrett requirements, and then raising those changes into Garrett. So it's a separate project. It is very much related, though, in the fact that we're basically talking about the opposite side of the coin. How do you raise something from Garrett and from GitHub and GitLab into Garrett? That was not exactly the target of this particular talk, but obviously it's kind of related.
Yeah, I was just clarifying because we talked about this at length. I just wanted to know what's
Yes.
in scope and what's not.
Yeah, right now the in scope is Garrett to platform, not platform to Garrett, outside of the final voting part. You want me to go back another slide now?
Yeah, I'm thinking of about the other part I was about to ask is actually issue tracking, and the problem is that as far as I know, and I'm a less than fluent user of these platforms, is that the issue tracking is really bare bones in that for example, you cannot cross-reference issues as
Yes, you can.
in, aside from mentioning them, I mean, having something like a issue in Yank Tools is blocking another issue in MDSAL, which are completely separate projects.
You're correct. At the issue tracking level, you can't do that specifically in either of the platforms because they have a very much a platform repository view versus Jira, which has a more project-oriented view that allows you to do cross-referencing that way. You are correct in that. We don't have a solution that would provide that capability outside of sticking with Jira and then dealing with all the everything that falls through from that, right? Along with the fact that Atlassian has consistently told the Linux Foundation for the last 2+ years that they won't provide data center licenses. They have been. We're not certain how long they're actually going to hold doing that because they keep telling us that they won't do that.
Okay, that's fair. Another question is whether you did some sort of reach out, because, for example, ASF has a metric ton of projects on Jira. And well, essentially, have you talked to them as to what their plans are with concretely issues Apache org?
The Apache Foundation? No, we haven't
Yeah.
specifically talked with them about
Yeah,
this.
that might be a good idea because they are facing the same problem.
They're facing the same problem. All of the projects that are part of LF are facing this problem. And so the LFN Jira Confluence setup is honestly a drop in the bucket of all of these platforms that we are dealing with. Apache's Foundation is going to be, you know, obviously they're outside of LF, so we can't influence that or talk about that outside of, you know, reaching out and saying, hey, what are you doing?
Yeah.
But I do know, like, for instance, right now, the Jenkins project, which is part of the Continuous Integration Foundation here at Linux Foundation, recently reached out to Atlassian, and they are providing a data center license that is in excess, or at least it's supposed to be in excess of what they're offering to other open source projects, because the Jenkins project is, or excuse me, it wouldn't be in excess. It would have been if they'd had to go to cloud. They literally can't go to cloud. They're so big. The requirements that they have exceed even the largest paid for version of Jira Cloud, which is kind of fascinating to me, that an open source project is basically saying we're too big for your platform, outside of a standalone setup. So we're working through that with them as well, and it's a big issue for them because they have a lot of issues, right? They've been using this for a long time, and so we're bringing this to all the communities because of the fact that it's going to take at least a year to do anything, and we have just over a year, like a year and 2 days at this point, to finish some sort of transformation.
Yeah. So a related question is whether if we were to consolidate our Jira instances, do we have any visibility as to whether we would actually be in the same situation as those folks?
We would have to actually do an account validation. I can say right now that the last I heard from the folks I've been talking with Atlassian, the open source cloud edition that they have, they're only offering up to 5,000 accounts essentially. And to go past that, you have to be on their paid edition, and they don't go past like 50,000 accounts in their largest paid edition, and that becomes very expensive. Would LFN as a whole exceed the cloud capabilities? We don't know. It wouldn't exceed the data center capabilities because data center is essentially the standalone server with clustering capabilities and a few other things that were needed for government and agencies that had specific requirements. So would we exceed data center? No, I don't think we would exceed capabilities of data center, but we would be looking at, probably, if we went the data center route, we would probably be looking at doing a cluster of the systems, consolidating. That way, we'd probably see a small reduction in costs across LFN just from the consolidation instead of running a whole bunch of silos. But we would also deal with the fact we have to do these data migrations and resolve any namespace collisions that might occur in those imports.
And we do all of that, but we have no guarantee that they will continue to support the data center version based upon.
Well, I'm assuming they will probably continue to support the data center version because they're keeping it because of government entities that basically say we can't have this off premises, right?
Got it.
But
Got it.
the big issue is, are they going to continue offering licenses gratis the way they have been to us previously for open source?
Oh, it's the license piece that they say.
It's the license piece that they keep telling us.
Yeah. Okay.
We're not doing this. And I have a serious concern that come February 15 of 2024, they will stop issuing us open source licenses for data center.
Got it. Okay. Thank you.
Yeah. I mean, that's just me being paranoid, given how Atlassian generally treats a lot of their customers.
Okay, so we've got about 5 minutes left.
Yep.
Other questions, concerns? This is not something that we are looking to do. This is something that's heading towards us, like the doomsday meteor.
Kenny, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, go ahead, Marshall.
So the issue is really about licensing issue by Atlassian to LF, right? That's the core of the issue.
The issue at core is really about licensing, honestly.
And can you explain exactly? It is Atlassian that give licenses to Linux Foundation to do what?
So at present, they provide any open source project that meets their criteria a free license, right? You have to, when you're standing up a new server, you get a trial license, which is good for like 30 days, and then you have to petition for a proper license, and then they give it to you free of charge. And after that, it's basically been just an automatic renewal per year. Our biggest concern from the IT side is that they will discontinue that with the data center system later in on, and pricing on data center is exorbitant to try and catch that as small as possible.
Okay, so
yeah.
Yes, so it means that instead of free license, it will be something that you need to pay.
Yes, and given the number of seats that we currently use in many of our projects, it becomes cost crippling to the projects, like eats most of their budget, crippling.
Yeah, on that part, do we have any visibility as to the account activity that we're having? Because you obviously can deactivate an account and then you can't log in to, say, Jira, but the identity is still there and you don't need to delete the user and it doesn't count towards the account.
We could probably come up with something, but that's honestly putting a whole band-aid on this thing.
Yeah, just thinking out loud.
Yeah.
I have a couple concerns with that particularly. One is it's putting a band-aid on the situation and just basically kicking the can down the road to when Atlassian decides, no, we're not going to do this anymore. Because I'm pretty certain at some point they're going to say, no, we're not going to do this anymore, just given the way they've gone about this. Number two is that it means that we are having to put together custom tooling just to keep this running. And number three is IT keeps getting requests from the board, the LFN board specifically, to reduce costs. And when we know for a fact that we can bring the cost of Wiki and issue tracking to essentially zero, at some point the board's going to say, why don't you do that?
Yeah, the one thing in terms of once you go to what they require is essentially a named user license, right? So if for us to be able to effectively manage it, we need to take that approach regardless of what their licensing model is. So enabling accounts, disabling accounts, there's a whole massive tooling effort and tons of administrative overhead just in monitoring that gets introduced. That alone could very well eat up LFN's budget. So we have a year and 2 days to have not only an action plan, but actually action being taken on this. So obviously it's a conversation needs to take place at the TAC, and it's a conversation that every single TSC that we have in LFN needs to be taking very seriously in terms of what direction we want to go and weighing in on that.
Correct. And on that unfortunate note, I believe we are done with this talk because we've got less than 6 seconds before my time's up.
Yep. Thank you very much, Andy.
You're welcome.
Appreciate it. David, I will reassign or give you host access.